The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strategies for managing your lab move. My name is Sasha, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a brief overview on what today's webinar is going to entail, as well as a short introduction for our speaker today. Today's webinar will start with a slideshow presentation by our in-house expert, Ian Lanza. The webinar will give you expert insight into a tried lab relocation process and share an approach to lab relocation that will help you reduce your project costs, minimize complications, keep compliance, and decrease moving time. Now I'm going to move into how you can interact with us on the webinar. At the end of this webinar, there will be an open Q&A. You can ask a question by typing them into your chat pane on the right where it says questions. So everyone on the webinar will remain muted throughout the webinar. You can interact by typing in the chat pane, and I will moderate to our expert speaker, Ian. All unanswered questions will be answered and sent out in an email after the presentation. In addition to the questions, all attendees will receive a recording of the presentation and a copy of the deck used today. Today's speaker, Ian Lanza, is the Regional Director of Life Sciences at Triumvirate Environmental. He works to add value to companies by improving sustainability, environmental and safety performance while driving costs down. He works closely with the world's premier biotech and pharmaceutical companies and executive leadership to identify sustainability and environmental opportunities that can have short-term and long-term impacts. He has successfully led and managed numerous lab relocation projects and has been employed with Triumvirate Environmental for over 8 years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Sasha. So just a brief agenda. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, why companies are moving, some of the drivers behind that. Controlling chaos. It's going to be some more project management tips on how to organize and build a team in order to get through lab relocation successfully. Then phase 3, the relocation project phases. We're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into each phase and try to provide tips on how to do them successfully. And then very briefly, just some closing thoughts and some reflections on the whole type of project. This time, I want to do a quick poll and just see how many of you out there are planning or preparing to do a lab move. All right, so it looks like we got most people to respond there. So it looks like we have a decent amount preparing for a lab move in the next little bit here. So hopefully you find this insightful. So just to talk about business a little bit, obviously in the business environment, rapidly changing, whether your company's changing or the real estate market is changing. You have companies that are constantly adjusting to market success, market decline, adjusting to various volatile markets. And basically what this means to many of you is that you're either growing, you're expanding, which in turn means you need to move into a much larger space, which has certain implications. If you are relatively steady, you're probably going to stay where you are. However, if the real estate market and those prices are changing, your size is staying the same, you could still potentially move to another site to better suit you. Or if there's some sort of decline, a lot of times you see companies move from an existing space into a smaller lab space that's just more correctly sized for their current business operations. So those are really the 3 different scenarios that we run into when companies make the decision to move. And understanding that backstory helps a little bit as you jump into these following planning phases. So as I talk to people about the relocations and try and help them through the process, really comes down to maintaining business continuity during a facility relocation. It's a unique project in that everyone involved with it at your company is going to be impacted. And they're going to be impacted in a manner where their day-to-day work is going to be completely disrupted, right? They're going to be asked to stop doing what they're doing, package everything up, and move it. Similarly to whenever you've had to move from an apartment to apartment or one house to another house, think about how your life kind of gets turned upside down for a little bit. You literally have to package everything up and move it. So how do you maintain business continuity during this process? It becomes a very, very large challenge for any company, and specifically probably you if you're going to be participating in the management of this relocation. So that being said, there's 4 core things I try and think about. If you make these a priority and you weave this throughout the rest of the presentation and the rest of your planning up until when you complete the move, it will help improve the business continuity and make it a little bit smoother. So number 1 is the timelines. If you have the chance to build in a little bit of a buffer, I would often encourage you to try and do that. From when leases end to when leases begin, these are complex projects, and a lot of times there will be a little bit of movement in the timeline. So something to always closely consider. Cost is obviously a huge one. How much is it going to cost your company to shut down, to move? Is it something you're trying to really minimize that space? Do you have a little bit of time that you can be down for a little bit? It's not going to incur huge costs, and so on. Logistics becomes a big driver to time and cost. How quickly can you move things? Employing critical path thinking. What needs to move before the other piece of it? And then when you intertwine that with business continuity to ensure you can continue operating, it adds a whole other layer onto it. And then finally, risk. I have to put that on there. It becomes the equalizer to the first 3 bullets. If your boss is telling you we can't shut down or we can only be shut down for 2 hours, make it happen. Obviously, when you try and squeeze everything together, the risk of something going wrong or one thing getting out of sync gets much, much, much higher, which could throw the whole thing off. Same with cost and logistics. So I always want you to be thinking about and weighing the risks of trying to do it cheaper, condense the timeline, get very aggressive with logistics. Because if you're not considering risk and something does go wrong, it can have a huge, huge impact on business continuity. So you have to find a way to really juggle and prioritize those 4 concepts. So again, as I go through the rest of this slide deck, I want you to keep those 4 concepts in the back of your mind and how you would make decisions based on those 4 drivers. So controlling the chaos. Again, my experience has been these relocation projects, again, this is a group that I often find doesn't get pulled in until much later down the path. But in order to execute this move, there's going to be a lot of external stakeholders that are going to play a very, very important role in this relocation. Whether it's your environmental consultants or the other folks moving the other materials, if it's construction workers and contractors building up the facility you're moving into, all these external stakeholders are going to play a huge, huge role on your ability to successfully manage this project and do it successfully. And then finally, like any business or project in the United States, you got to pay attention to the regulators. And there's a lot of, because these projects are very diverse and have a wide scope, there's a lot of different regulators. You know, from the environmental folks to transportation to cities and towns. There's going to be a lot of different people that you want to make sure you have all of your ducks in a row with them in order to move through everything easily. Once you've really identified all of those stakeholders, I would spend a little bit of time to understand the expectations and needs of each one of those stakeholders. This is important. Again, if you're pulling one or two people from each group, I've found that they're each going to have a pretty unique set of expectations and needs, and their expectations and needs are going to be the most important ones, right? So you're going to be with a group of people who are all representing something different. That is the most important, and it's really important early on in the process to understand that, and it'll help you build a team, build an agenda, and build a project plan that will satisfy all those needs and expectations. You don't want to get you know, blindsided by a stakeholder you hadn't considered while the project is well underway. And so you take the stakeholder map you have, you've identified them, you understand the expectations of the project, and then you can begin to understand how long this will take, develop a budget, and begin to understand logistics. So each stakeholder is going to impact time, budget, logistics, and then risk differently. And so, again, the first step is to identify what all of that is. Once you've built this team and you really understand those needs, you know, I encourage you to take representatives from each one of those stakeholder groups and build a relocation team. I would also, again, encourage you to pull in the external stakeholders to this team. The regulators, you know, they're probably going to be less likely to join your relocation team, but you want to make sure you have buy-in from them. And once you've joined this team, then you have the opportunity to really map everything out and get buy-in from each one of these groups. So part of this team, the first step should be to really draft or build a project plan. Again, using that stakeholder map. I also encourage you to think about critical path thinking. A lot of this will have to do with logistics, but what needs to occur before something can move, both on the prep side as well as where it's going to be received. And this can be something very, very physical. For example, relocating cold material, right? You need to package it a certain way, you need to transport it a certain way, and you need to have some sort of refrigeration capability when it arrives there. So that's something very, very physical. Another less physical thing could be a certain permit, right? Before you're able to start operating in a new space, you may need a specific type of permit to do so. So you want to make sure you've done this critical path thinking for the physical pieces, the regulatory pieces, and some of the other soft or HR pieces as well. And then again, the risk management component, how once you've done that stakeholder map, there's going to be certain needs you'll see throughout the whole group that are going to float to the top, and it's important to identify a way to manage those needs. A good way to, and so you're going to build this plan, and this plan is going to change. Unfortunately, you can't get everybody together in January, build this plan, and then execute a relocation in September. It really doesn't work like that. So what I found is the more successful companies that do this, they'll build this team well in advance, and then they'll have routine meetings. And the frequency of those meetings will really depend on how complex or sophisticated the move is, how much information you have when, Early on, maybe it makes sense to meet once a month or every other week. And then as it's really coming together, you're going to want to increase the frequency. And again, this is an opportunity to kind of continue to flesh out those stakeholder needs and expectations, to identify and really drill down on the critical path thinking, so by the time the actual relocation occurs, you have a rock-solid plan that you feel comfortable executing on. Just some tips, just like with any other meeting that you're holding, especially a routine meeting. I found it's important to always keep an agenda in meetings. I found that especially early on, there's going to be a lot of ideas coming around. Everyone's going to be spouting one thing or another. And again, the more successful ones I've been part of, all that information has been collected, written down, so that the next week you're continuing to move forward and you're not getting stuck on a certain topic. Then I mentioned frequency before, but use frequency to drive interest and efficiency in the project. If you do it too often and you're not really accomplishing everything, something every meeting, people will lose interest, they'll stop going, and when you need them to be there, it'll become a problem. Likewise, if you don't do it enough, it may not be taken seriously enough, or important decisions would have come up in the time span between the meetings, and you may have missed out on certain stakeholder input. So unfortunately, I can't prescribe exactly how often you should be doing it, but keep in mind it is another way to kind of manage interest in the project. So those are some tips as far as building a team and identifying what needs to happen in pre-planning and so on and so forth. I'm going to show a couple slides on just the different phases, and then again I'm going to drill into each phase and provide more tips and kind of detail on how to successfully navigate each one of those phases. So the first phase is your design phase, and I call this phase 0. This may have already occurred at this point if you have a relocation coming up, but the facility that you're going to be moving into, what is it going to look like? How big is it going to be? What are going to be the safety controls that are in place? What is the IT infrastructure? What's the electrical infrastructure? Hopefully this relocation stakeholders are part of that discussion, because when it comes to moving and setting up the new lab, this group is going to have a lot of questions based on how it was designed. So the earlier you can bring these stakeholders really into the whole phase of relocation before that, this design phase, the more successful it's going to be. A couple of topics to really focus in on: hazardous material flow. You'll see as I go through this, I'm going to spend a lot of time on managing hazardous material in the environmental portion, and then provide just a couple other examples of other things. So again, during this design phase, if you focus on how hazmat will flow through a facility, how it will be received, distributed to where it's going to be worked with, collected as a waste, and then back out, whether as a product or as waste. If you've designed all that, it's going to be much smoother during the relocation process. And then other things that may come up, again, facility design, engineering, electrical, HVAC, so on and so forth. All right, so you've designed it, you've done your pre-planning meetings for several months, hopefully, and it's time to actually begin the relocation. Phase 1 I call disposal. Essentially, I'm suggesting that you get rid of everything that you're not going to move to your new facility. As an EHS and facility person, I really like this concept. People that have held on to things, projects come and go, staff come and go, but their materials stay there. This is a great opportunity to just get rid of everything that you don't need at this new facility. And this does a couple things. It makes the move a little bit more efficient, and it will reduce the risk of the move, essentially because there'll be less stuff to move. So again, from the environmental standpoint, think about all the chemicals that are either wastes or you're never going to use in your new facility, and dispose of them before the move begins. Other things to think about: consumables, other equipment, other infrastructure like that really doesn't make sense to move. Just get rid of it prior to the relocation. Then it comes into the move phase, phase 2. think about and identify all of the hazardous materials that are going to move. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, what you should be thinking about. But next to the hazardous material move, there's also the equipment or furniture move. Finally, once you've moved everything, generally you'll have to do some sort of cleaning or decontamination of the space. From the environmental standpoint, this will include lab spaces or other environmental infrastructure. And then usually in your lease, there's something in there about non-lab spaces as well, whether it's broom clean or something. The closure assessment, this is really managing your environmental liability. So there's certain work that you'll want to do on the hazardous material front. And then there are other lease obligations that you have that you need to close out. Phase 5, permitting and licensing. And again, this phase actually can begin as early as phase 0 in identifying what permits and licenses you're going to need at the new facility, your EHS programs, permits, licenses, and then other ones that, again, fall outside of the environmental sphere, but you'll still need to operate. And then finally, the last phase, phase 6, EHS programs and systems. I'll make a small argument at the very end. It's a great opportunity to launch new EHS programs and systems. You're in a new space. You're physically in a new space. If you want to roll out a new policy or new engineering control, it's a great opportunity to do that. So those are the various project phases. This is another way to look at that. This is the concept of critical path thinking or a Gantt chart, really just throw on PowerPoint. So on the top part is your existing facility, so that's where you are today. Again, you dispose of everything, you move the chemicals, you decontaminate the lab space, and then you'll have to close it out. And then at the same time, a lot of times, you're going to be designing your new facility. There's certain permitting and plans that you'll need to put in place prior to the chemical move. And then once you're in your new space, training and EHS program implementation and maintenance. Again, an opportunity to kind of start new with a lot of those programs. So again, phase 0, the design phase, a real opportunity to engage the relocation stakeholders. Again, if you pull them into that phase, how you move critical path thinking, what gets moved where. If they're already familiar with the engineering controls or the logistics that you've designed in your new space, it will make those conversations much easier. I've been in many relocation meetings where we're talking about that and we just don't know the answer to what the new space is going to look like. So it makes it hard to really plan on how to efficiently move into that space. Material flow, I talked about that a lot. Again, I would really encourage you to think about hazmat, material flow, consumable flow, if you're a manufacturing facility, product flow, and so on. And then finally, engineering controls. Again, as an EHS person, I really like to take these relocations as an opportunity to design in new engineering controls that you may not have been able to have at the previous place. Things that either make it safer for your employees or more efficient. So that's better ventilation, better access to something, those types of things. And if you, again, interconnect that into the relocation, it will be much more of an efficient process down the road. All right, discard those chemicals before you move. So from the environmental standpoint, again, we want to get rid of any wastes that you have there. Expired chemicals, this is another one, depending on what industry you're in. If you're in the pharmaceuticals, you're not really going to be able to use expired chemicals anyways. If you have other peroxide formers or other things like that, again, just a good opportunity to get all this stuff out there. And then finally, irrelevant materials. And I've seen it so many times where they've brought in some sort of material or chemical for a project. The project is no longer ongoing, but all of the either equipment or chemicals are still there. Again, great opportunity to get everything out. As you're going through this process on deciding exactly what to discard, consider the risk of moving a material versus disposing and buying a new material. Think about the risk of moving a material that you may use in the future, but you're not really sure. And while you do that analysis, think about the regulatory obligations as well. So especially in the hazmat world, there's certain materials that are more heavily regulated. Obviously, any of your chemicals, there's certain packaging and DOT requirements involved in the transportation. Other ones, like radioactives or biologicals, there may be other permitting or licensing implications with moving it. So again, the big concept is don't move anything you don't need to. And then finally, if it's something relatively small, it may make more sense just to get rid of and buy new when you need it later on. Other things to think about, furniture, consumables. Basically, the concept here is the less that you move, the easier the project's going to be. Again, think about those 4 bullets I talked about earlier on. It's going to reduce the time it takes to move, it's going to make the logistics easier, it's going to reduce the cost, and it's going to reduce the risk. All right, phase 2, it's time to begin your move. So as you think about what actually needs to move, identify all of the materials and equipment well before the move. This may even help you identify which external stakeholders you need to engage. Make sure you truly understand the regulatory obligations with moving or setting it up in your new space. Again, the risks of moving it. And then identify any real high-risk material. Again, because that may make more sense just to get rid of and buy new when you get there. So when it comes time to mapping it all out and calling in your contractors and getting people ready to pack everything and figuring out what business systems are going to go down when and when they're all going to go back up, these are some of the tools to use here. So again, the critical path thinking. I really encourage you to map all of this out well before the move. Provide a pretty clear picture on how long it's going to take, what goes down, and when. Again, back to those kind of core messages we want to talk about. Think about the projected operational downtime. Again, depending on what type of business you are, your downtime may directly impact your bottom line, right? So you may be willing to pay a little bit more to try and condense that critical path thinking, or make a little bit higher risk moves in order to reduce that. How long will the whole thing take? When you're figuring that out, remember that there's certain time involved with prepping the material, packaging the material, loading the material, transporting the material, unloading the material, unpackaging it, and setting it up. So there's all those different steps within the actual move. And you'll want to understand really down to almost the hour how much each one of those phases is going to take. And then finally, logistics. So again, I spend a lot of time moving chemicals. One thing I always encourage clients to do is to allow us to move the chemicals before the furniture movers come in. I make the analogy, it's like elephants and ballerinas working next to each other. We're coming in working with smaller, high-risk chemicals. We don't take up a lot of space, but if you spill acids or solvents, it can be pretty serious. So I like to be able to get in and out before the other equipment moves. And this concept can be used with really everything that needs to move. Don't try and have all of your vendors move everything at 8 o'clock on Thursday. There's going to be too many people bumping into each other, and it's not going to work. That being said, you need to also consider the space that you're going to be moving into. Make sure that once the material is loaded and you have an arrival time, that you have the people and the infrastructure to receive certain materials. Again, I'll use cold materials, a pretty classic example. If we're packing cold material from a refrigerator into a cooler, transporting it to your new site, is there a cold room that the cold material will be placed in while the refrigerators get up and running, Will some refrigerators be moved over prior so that the material will be unloaded into refrigerators? You got to kind of think through some of those steps to ensure what's actually being moved isn't jeopardized. Went through a lot of this stuff. Other hazmat considerations, so I talked about cold materials, flammables, or other particularly hazardous chemicals. Do you have a place for them? Power ends up being a pretty important topic. Is there power for refrigerators or cold materials or fans or blowers, so on and so forth. And finally, I would encourage to have someone in your relocation team be present during the relocation. I've been part of relocation teams that have met every week for several months, and when it comes time to actually move something, there will inevitably be a question that comes up or something that has changed. If you have representatives from that team there, it will allow you to kind of move through certain changes much faster. All right, so you've done all the planning, you've built your team, you've disposed of everything, you've moved chemicals to your new site. Now 95% of your company is going to say, all right, great, let's start working. And that one EHS person that was on that relo team is now going to have to worry about shutting down that old facility and decontaminating it. Not a terribly glorifying part of the project, but definitely something that will probably need to be done in order to manage your environmental liability, fulfill lease obligations, so on and so forth. So prior to decontaminating a space, you need to identify a performance standard. How clean is clean? How will you be cleaning everything? So in order to do that, you want to consider these 4 bullets here. The first step is always to identify all potential contaminants. Depending on how long your facility's been there and what type of organizational knowledge you have, this may be easy or this may be a relatively complex exercise. You should go back from the beginning of your company or the beginning of when you were in that space and identify all of the projects you did, all of the materials you had there, where they were worked with, what volumes, review any incident or spill data that you have. And again, the purpose is to truly size up what could potentially be contaminating the space and how high that risk is. So that's the first step. The second one, identify what all of your lease obligations are. So especially if you are leasing it and you don't own the space, the landlord can hold that over you if you don't leave it clean. So there's usually something written into a lease. It may say something like you need to decontaminate it with an environmental contractor and a third-party CIH needs to sign off on it. So then at least they've begun to lay, you've had some sort of agreement on how you'll go about decontaminating it. But I encourage you to look at that. What I've found is that those leases vary significantly. The lease isn't the end-all and be-all. You as your organization, you have a certain amount of liability because you had hazmat in that space. So not only do you need to fulfill your lease obligations in order to get out of that agreement, there's future environmental liability that you're going to want to manage. So for example, if your lease says broom clean, you clean it, but then there is significant contamination left after you leave, you're still liable for that contamination. So there are certain environmental liability best management practices that you can adhere to and follow. And so once you've considered those 3 things, from there you'll build or develop a decontamination plan. And that plan will go through established scopes, means and methods for decontaminating everything, and then usually you'll want some sort of system in place to confirm clean. Basically what this will do is it will ensure that you've fulfilled your lease obligations and very clearly quantify the steps you've taken to limit your environmental liability. So as you go through identifying your contaminants, again, corrosive materials, toxics, oxidizers, peroxide formers, biologicals, radioactive, hazardous wastes, all of those things will mean something a little bit different on your means and methods to decontaminate the place. You want to consider the location of where these materials were used or potentially spilled. Is it an impervious surface? Could it have potentially leaked through concrete slab into sand? You know, that's a pretty tough situation. Is it in equipment? Is it in the soil? Is it in the building materials? Are there certain engineering systems that are contaminated, whether it's HVAC or wastewater system? So this analysis, identifying the contaminants, is a pretty robust process. And then the next step is to, again, identify the degree of contamination. Whether you're just working with it and there wasn't a lot of contact, so the contamination is minimal, or was there a significant leak or spill that was never able to be fully remediated. So you're going to, again, want to really try and quantify that. I talked about the lease language quite a bit. In addition to that, you know, I always encourage clients to engage the property owner in meetings and verbally to see if they can get a sense of what they're going to require. There's also organizational standards out there, so if you work for a much larger company, I've found that they often have certain standards in place as well. There is a ANSI standard on how clean is clean for laboratories. So if you're working in the research space, you know, I would really encourage you to make sure you're adhering to that methodology and you're engaging somebody that's familiar with that standard and can help build the decontamination project plan and sampling to comply with that standard. Again, that's really just an industry standard that's out there. And then the final bullet is your organizational risk tolerance. So I worked with some companies that have a pretty high risk tolerance, and you know, they won't go to extreme efforts to decontaminate everything, where other organizations very, very, very low tolerance, and they want to go above and beyond to ensure that they're not leaving anything behind. But I've also found that varies significantly from organization to organization. In developing the plan, again, take those steps I had discussed prior, work with key stakeholders to develop that plan, so EHS folks, facility folks. If you have people that can articulate the chemicals being used and the level of contamination, other stakeholders may be the property owner. If there is significant contamination, maybe there's regulators that are involved. You know, one tip in order to understand the level of contamination, you may want to do some sampling prior to the decontamination of high-risk areas. So in the research lab, this may include your wastewater unit, sink traps, fume hoods if they used peroxide formers or something like that. Anywhere where you really suspect there could be significant contamination, it's worth doing some sampling prior. That way you know what level of effort will be required. And once you pull that together, you know, this plan is really going to articulate the scope and the methods used to decontaminate everything. And again, this concept falls in line with that ANSI standard I had referenced before. I'd really encourage you to build this prior to phase 2, the actual move. And maybe your relocation team works on this as well. It's probably not a bad idea, because theoretically your relocation team is going to have stakeholders from every applicable business unit, and together they could help you identify contaminants and level of contamination. Things that you're going to have to decontaminate: laboratory surfaces, different types of infrastructure, so whether it's a wastewater unit, HVAC system, we have chip tanks in here, so on and so forth. And again, you want to keep an eye on high-risk areas, and I had mentioned some of those beforehand. One of the last steps in getting out of the facility is this closure assessment. So this is very closely linked to Phase 3, the decontamination, and is also prescribed in that ANSI standard that I referenced. And this includes documenting and ensuring the removal of all hazardous materials, wastes, building materials, chemicals that were stored on site that may have been moved to another facility. You want to be able to document and demonstrate that they are no longer at that facility. Make sure that you have somebody, it's generally a certified industrial hygienist or another environmental professional that can review the sampling plan and bless it or sign off on it to make sure that you're using the right methods to decontaminate everything. Confirm clean through both qualitative and quantitative methods. I think the ANSI standard talks a lot about the You're going to need to terminate all of your permits and licenses. So again, in the environmental world, if you are registered as a hazardous waste generator, you would want to terminate that. If you have any wastewater permits or licenses, you would terminate that. There's a whole slew of them. I think we would provide a list at the end. You'd want to make sure that those are all terminated and closed out. You don't want to just leave and set up new ones at the new site. You want to wrap that all up and close it all out. You want to document and report the entire process. Who was there to clean it? How long did it take them? What did they do? What did they encounter? So generally, decontamination crews will take notes, and that should be included in this report. If there was any discussion on how to attack certain contamination, you would want to include that in the report as well. And again, usually these have to be signed off by a qualified individual. A lot of times that's an industrial hygienist. Some other components of a closure report, blueprints, any sort of SOPs used during the decontamination. Photographs are great. Before and after photographs really demonstrates the level of effort used. Where's the sampling results? Hazardous waste manifests to demonstrate that waste was actually shipped off site, and so on. So these are just pieces of these reports. All right, Phase 5, permits and licensing. So during the relocation process, again, you're going to want to either terminate or move all of your permits and licenses from your existing facility to your new facility. Depending on what the permit or license is, you may be able to transfer it. Other times you just need to terminate it and then get a new one for your new facility. You don't want to terminate your permit or license until you have removed everything that it was regulating. So for example, your hazardous waste notification form, you would not send that in until all of the hazardous waste has been shipped out. Your wastewater unit, you wouldn't terminate that until you've completed the decon and there's going to be no more discharge. And then obviously you're going to want to keep all of your paperwork. As you're going through the planning phases of your relocation, you've hopefully identified everything that's going to move and what your capabilities are in your new space. From there, generally your EHS or contracts people will help you identify what types of permits that you're going to need in your new space. Again, I would strongly encourage you to start looking at this at least 6 months before the relocation. Some permits and licenses take longer to get than others, and they really all vary depending on exactly what you're looking at. But from a timeline standpoint, I would begin looking at this much sooner. Here's just some of the examples of the things that you're going to want to consider and look at. Again, each one of these have different lead times. Some of them you're allowed to transfer to your new facility. Others, they require you to terminate and get a new one in your new facility. And they're really all different lead times, so on and so forth. All right, last phase, your EHS programs and systems. Again, plan ahead. Make sure you have everything in place prior to the move so that once you move into your new facility, you can start operations immediately and kind of reduce the interruption to your business systems. Again, I think it's a great opportunity to implement new engineering controls that you may not have had the luxury of before, but if you can build them into your new space, that's great. Same with other behavioral programs. Just moving into a new physical space, it's a great time to kind of retrain people on systems and processes. They're already in a new physical location. By changing a policy, you may be a little bit more successful than moving and then trying to implement a process a year down the road. And again, if you want to, when you move, if you can plant the seed earlier, the better. So just a quick summary. These relocation projects are very complex because of the number of stakeholders impacted, the number of stakeholders needed to do it successfully. And oftentimes, it's very disruptive, whether it's for a short period of time or longer period of time to your business. I can't emphasize enough how important planning is. So you may have heard this before. Proper planning prevents poor performance. This is so true in these relocation projects. Some of the best ones I've been on or been a part of, we've had a lot of pre-planning. We've went through every single scenario. We knew exactly what was going to happen before we even started any of the work. And other ones that were much more chaotic, longer, ended up costing longer, going a little bit longer, bigger disruption to the business. There wasn't much planning at all. It was kind of brought in, we got to move everything, and then just kind of go. So again, I can't emphasize how important that relocation team is to stakeholder mapping and so on. And then finally, I would try and always think about these relocation projects as a chunk in a much larger project, right? So if you're part of the relocation team, can you also expand it into the design team, prior to the move on what this new facility is going to look like? And then think about on the other end, is there ways that we can improve the health and safety of our employees or of our systems in this new space? How can we make impacts 2 or 3 years down the road once we move? And by piecing that all together, will make the actual relocation more successful and a little bit easier. So at that point, I guess we'll open it up for questions.
Yep. All right. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can just type it into the questions pane in your chat bar. So feel free to do that. First question coming in, someone wants to know how long the actual lab move itself should take. How long should they plan on that taking?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to answer. It really depends on logistics and the quantity of stuff being moved. So for example, I just completed a move this week where we were actually on site 3 days to do the move. We're only on site 3 or 4 hours each day because they needed to move it in chunks. So we needed to get everything out of one space on day 1 so that they can move equipment, so that we can move other stuff day 2, so that they can move other things on day 3. As part of a very large relocation this summer, that it literally took us 4 months to move the entire facility. So it really depends on the situation and the amount of stuff that you have to move.
Great. Someone else wants to know what permits they'll need prior to starting the lab move.
So to actually do the chemical move, you won't need any permits. You'll need vendors that are permitted to transport chemicals on DOT roads. So a company like Triumvirate, we have all of those permits to do that. And then depending on exactly what you have, what types of chemicals or hazmat you're using, will depend on what types of permits that you need. So we'll send the presentation out here, but one of the last slides, it provided a list. There was about 10 different permits on there. It wasn't comprehensive at all, but those are the core ones. One thing I would say, because I know we have people joining from all different geographies, look at what the federal regulations are, the state regulations are, and then your town or city regulations. So I'm based up here in Somerville or Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there's a lot of Cambridge regulations that require additional permits and so on that, in a different geography may not be necessary.
Great. I have one more question coming in. If anybody else has another question, we definitely have time for a couple more, so feel free to type them into your chat pane on the right. Someone wants to know if their landlord decides that their lab was not clean enough after doing a decontamination, what's the best course of action?
Right, so that's a really good question. It goes to what I was talking about as far as really managing the big picture liability. So I found that most times leases are specifically vague, and then other times landlords may not want to tell you exactly what their expectations are. If that's the case, I'm strongly recommending adhering to the ANSI guidelines of how to decontaminate a research lab or a manufacturing space, because then that is a third-party certified method for how to do it. And if you have a service contract with somebody that is adhering to that standard and you provide that closure document at the end, I listed some of the things in it. These are hundreds of pages documenting literally every last step to get out of that facility. If you provide that to them, it's very hard for them to tell you it's not clean. The only case they may do that is if they have a third party that has also done sampling, and their sampler results are different from yours, then there could be some contention there. But if you're adhering to that ANSI standard, you're really covering a lot of your liability that way.
All right, great. It looks like we don't have any other questions, so I think we can close out the webinar now. Just so everybody knows, again, we'll send you an email with a copy of the presentation along with a recording later today. The email will also have a link to a survey asking you to rate this webinar. If you could fill it out, that'd be very helpful. In addition, you can find these webinars as well as upcoming webinars on our events page at www.triumvirate.com/training/events. And I will send that to you in the email as well. You don't have to remember that. Thanks again for attending, everybody, and closing out the webinar. Bye.